So in the last couple classes, we've been looking at two different types of theories of ethics. And the first theory we looked at is one known as moral realism. And to remind you, what moral realism is the view that there are at least some objective moral truths. And truthfully, for the realist, all there needs to be is at least one moral truth that is objectively true. So if you believe that murder is wrong and it's wrong for everybody and anybody, then you'd be a moral realist. Cultural relativism is a different type of ethical theory, and this holds two different theses. The first one is that there are no objective moral truths. And secondly, according to cultural relativism, moral truths depend on each distinct culture. So what the cultural relativist basically says is that every society or every culture creates their own views of morality, and there's no overarching moral truths that should bind on every society. For this reason, if one society says that murder is wrong, then it's wrong for that society, and that's all there is to it. However, if another society says murder is morally permissible, then for that society, it's morally permissible to murder. And there's nothing anyone can appeal to over and above what the society says to tell them that they're wrong. Now, last class we looked at three arguments for cultural relativism. We looked at the cultural differences argument, the education argument, and the argument from tolerance. Today what we're going to do is we're going to look at criticisms of these three arguments as well as criticisms of cultural relativism. And we're going to turn to an essay that was written by this man, James Rachels. James Rachels was a philosopher who taught at the University of Alabama, and he published a number of books and articles on ethics and other subjects in philosophy. As you can see, James Rachels passed away a handful of years ago, but his book on ethics, from which the chapter I had you guys read today on cultural relativism is taken, his book on ethics has been an extremely influential book and is still being widely used amongst colleges and universities today. We're actually going to end up reading a lot from James Rachels because I think he's a really good writer and he explains a lot of important issues in ethics very clearly and precisely. One thing I want to point out, and this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, students always seem to refer to James Rachels as she. They look at this right here and say, oh, Rachels. That's his last name. It's James, Jimmy. So don't call James Rachels she. And don't say Rachel. It's Rachels with an S. It's not a big deal, but it is a little pet peeve, and it shows that you haven't been paying attention. So anyway, we're going to look at an article written by James Rachels. It was in his book on ethics. And in this article, James Rachels rejects cultural relativism. Last class we looked at three arguments for cultural relativism, but Rachels launches a pretty severe criticism of cultural relativism. And he makes two basic points. And one argument, or one basic point that he makes, is he says that the arguments for relativism are unsuccessful. So the arguments we've looked at so far, the cultural differences argument, the education argument, and the argument from tolerance. And what Rachel says is these arguments don't work. They don't prove that cultural relativism is actually true. Secondly, he wants to argue that even independent of these arguments' failure, cultural relativism itself, when you just look at the view itself, it has consequences that make it implausible. So what Rachels is trying to do is offer a 1-2 punch. He's saying, number one, your arguments for your view don't work. And then number two, your view itself, cultural relativism, that view is just preposterous. So let's turn to and look at what Rachel says. And we're going to begin by looking at what Rachel says in terms of the unsuccessfulness of the arguments for cultural relativism. And as I've said in the past, the main argument, the most important argument for cultural relativism is the cultural differences argument. And this is the one that James Rachels spends the most time criticizing. And he says that this argument just does not work, that it's not convincing. And to remind you, what the cultural differences argument says is just this. Different cultures have drastically different moral practices and beliefs. Therefore, moral truths are created by each distinct culture, and there are no objective moral truths. And basically, what this is doing, this argument, is drawing the inference that cultural relativism is true. Because what the conclusion is basically just a statement of cultural relativism. And is drawing this conclusion based on the fact that when we look out across the world, we see that different cultures have wildly different moral practices and beliefs. Keep in mind here, the different practices and beliefs, these are those deep moral disagreements we were talking about. It's not just simply superficial practices and beliefs that are important, because no one's going to deny that different societies have superficial differences, differences such as bowing instead of shaking hands, or differences such as taking your shoes off when you enter your house, or putting mayonnaise on French fries. It's really these deep moral disagreements about justice, about theft, about murder, about cultural participation and cooperation within society, about how we raise our children, about how we show respect and honor the dead. Do we eat the dead? Do we cremate the dead? It's these types of deep disagreements that exist, which a lot of people believe establishes the truth of cultural relativism. And what Rachel says is this argument just does not work. And he has two criticisms of the cultural differences argument. And the first criticism is that the argument itself is invalid. And secondly, he goes on, after showing that it's invalid, to argue that premise 1 actually exaggerates the extent of cultural disagreements. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at each of these criticisms that Rachel's makes. And keep in mind here, these criticisms are just against this argument, the cultural differences argument. These criticisms right here are not criticisms against cultural relativism, the theory. It's just against this argument right here. So let's turn to and look at this first point that Rachel's makes. The cultural differences argument is invalid. Now, he's not saying here that this argument he's not saying invalid in the way that we typically think of it. The way James Rachels uses the term invalid is the way that we were previously discussing when we were covering elements of argumentative evaluation. And just to give you a reminder, when we talk about valid or invalid arguments, we're referring to deductive arguments. And a deductive argument is one in which it is intended that the premises entail the conclusion. To give you some examples as a refresher, you may recall that a valid argument is one in which the premises, if they're true, then the conclusion has to be true. And right here is an example of a valid argument. If premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, then the conclusion has to be true. However, this was an example of an invalid argument. Premise 1 is true, or premise 1 can be true, and premise 2 can be true, and yet the conclusion does not have to be true. The premises do not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. And what James Rachels wants to say is that the cultural differences argument is invalid in this sense right here. It's invalid because even if the premises are true, the conclusion does not have to be true. So let's turn back and look at the cultural differences argument again. Different cultures have drastically different moral practices and beliefs. Therefore, moral truths are created by each distinct culture, and there are no objective moral truths. And what you need to ask yourself is just this. Even if you grant that the first premise, or the only premise, is true, that different cultures have drastically different moral practices and beliefs, does this guarantee, does it entail, does it necessitate that there are no objective moral truths? And what Rachel points out is no. Just because people disagree about morality does not entail that there are no objective moral truths. And to give you a way of seeing that this is so, consider a parallel argument. And I'm going to call this the shape of the earth argument. And we could say, premise 1, different cultures have drastically different beliefs about the shape of the earth. And conclusion, therefore there is no objective truth about the earth's shape. Now, let's assume that premise one is true. And if we were to travel back in time, this would definitely have been true. If we travel back in time, there was a time where some people thought the earth was flat, some thought it was round, and maybe even other people thought the earth was a different shape. But even if we were to concede that different cultures had very different beliefs about the shape of the earth, would it follow that the earth, there's no objective truth about the earth's shape? Surely not. Just because people disagree doesn't mean there is no truth of the matter. And we can say the exact same thing about morality. Just because people disagree about the shape of or moral truths doesn't mean that there is no objective truth. Here's a potential counterexample. Perhaps we can concede that different cultures have drastically different moral practices and beliefs. But another possible conclusion or explanation of this is that some cultures believe moral truths that are correct and some cultures are incorrect. So the point here is that the conclusion does not follow, it is not guaranteed by the premise. And the fundamental flaw of the cultural differences argument is just this. The premise is a premise about what people believe, whereas the conclusion is a conclusion about what is true. And what the point he makes is that you can't draw a valid inference about what is true from what people believe. Just because people believe something, that has no implications about the reality of the way the world actually is. And this is true if we're talking about morality or if we're talking about the shape of the earth. Now, I know some of you might be saying, wait, hold on. There's a big difference here. In the shape of the earth argument, we can look and we can see, we can test scientifically that the earth has a particular shape. And maybe that's all well and good. But notice if that's the direction you go, you're actually changing the argument. Now the argument is about what we can test scientifically. And that's a horse of an entirely different color. But the cultural differences argument, the way it's actually written, is nothing about what we can test scientifically. The conclusion or the argument is based solely on the fact that cultures disagree, and therefore there are no objective moral truths. If you want to go down the corridor or the path of talking about what is true based on science, we could engage in that conversation at a later time. But this argument, the way it stands, the way it's written, all it says is different cultures have different beliefs, and therefore there are no objective moral truths. And that conclusion simply does not follow from the premise. It does not follow because it's a conclusion about what is true, and the premise is a premise about what people actually believe. So, that's Rachel's first criticism of the cultural differences argument. And my response, what I would say to Rachel's is, he seems exactly right. As far as that goes, he's 100% right. The argument, if we look at this argument as it is written, the argument just is invalid. Now maybe there's a way we could reconstruct it to put it in a valid form. I'm not going to worry too much about that, because I think Rachel's second criticism that he raises would undermine the argument even if it was reworded into a valid form. So we're just going to grant Rachel's, or I am for the time being, that this first point is right. The argument is invalid. The cultural differences argument is invalid. But even if we recognize that the argument's invalid, we have to acknowledge that these cultural differences, these drastic cultural differences that we've looked at about the Eskimos, the Kwakayutal, the Melanesians, these things are interesting, and they do seem to undermine moral realism in some way or another. And so what Rachel's wants to do is he wants to also attack the first premise of the argument. And what he claims is he says that these cultural differences that we've looked at, that they've been extremely exaggerated. That even though it seems like all these cultures have wildly different practices and beliefs, they're actually, once you look at them and peer beneath the surface, they're not so wildly different as it may first appear. And so what Rachel's goes on to do is he goes on to make 4 points. And these points show that there aren't as many differences amongst cultures, morally speaking, as there first appears to be. And the first point that James Rachels makes is he says, look, there's just not as much differences because when you look out and when you inspect various cultures, you're actually going to find that there are some values that are shared by nearly all cultures. And he points to things like truth telling and promise keeping. Every society believes in some level of truth telling or promise keeping. Every society believes or has and holds certain prohibitions against murder. Now, there may be some societies which are a little more relaxed on murder, and there may be some societies in which what they count as murder, we don't count as murder, but you're not going to find any society which says you can kill anyone at any time for any reason that you want. That's not going to exist. There are always going to be certain rules in place about when it's appropriate to kill another person and when it's not appropriate. So that it's not a total free-for-all in any society. And so what Rachel says is, look, you can find some common elements around the globe in all societies. And truthfully, in order to be a moral realist, that's all you need. All you need to show is that there is some commonality. Secondly, what Rachel says is that some of these differences we've been provided, some of these things which appear to be extreme moral differences, when you peer beneath the surface, they actually reveal a certain amount of agreement. So look at the difference between the Galatians and the Greeks and how they respected their dead. The Galatians, they would eat their dead. However, the Greeks, they would cremate their dead. But notice here, both of them thought it was important to show respect to the dead. In neither society did they just view their deceased relatives as just lumps of matter to be disposed of. Rather, they had certain feelings about how it was appropriate to show respect to the dead. And so what we can distill from these different practices is an underlying level of agreement. You should show respect to the dead. And what Rachel argues is that you can do this for a lot of different practices which seem to be highly different. Sometimes culture X does Y and another culture does something different. However, when you peer beneath the surface, you can find some level of commonality between them. Another point that Rachel makes, and I think this is actually a very, very good one, is that a lot of these differences that the cultural relativist points to, they don't really reveal differences of morality. Rather, what they reveal is that sometimes life is hard, and life forces people to make extremely difficult decisions. And the decisions that are being forced to be made are decisions that even we might very well make if we were in a similar position. And so we look back to, for instance, the Eskimos killing their infants. And when the Eskimos did this, they didn't just kill infants for no reason. In fact, when the Eskimos would kill their infants, it was always a measure of last resort. The mother, she would take her child and try to get someone else to take care of it if she could. But if that failed, if no one could take care of it, then it would be a decision which the mother was forced to make. Because life for the Eskimos was really, really hard. Food was not abundant. Conditions were difficult. People were forced to just scratch and claw for their very survival. And so it was sad and unfortunate, but sometimes mothers would have to make a decision between trying to feed 5 children, and in the case that she tried to do that, maybe all of them would starve because she wouldn't have enough food, or killing one to save 4. And it's a horrible choice. No mother would want to do that. The Eskimo mothers, they wouldn't want to do that either. But it's a choice between life. Should you allow 5 to die, or should you kill 1 to save 4? And just because the mother made that hard, difficult decision doesn't show that she had a different value for life. Of course, if she could have kept all of her children, she would have chosen to do it. And the fact that she had to kill 1 doesn't mean that she didn't value its life. Consider an analogy here. Suppose you saw 2 children drowning in a pond, and you only had time to save 1. would that show that you didn't value the other child's life if you let them drown? Of course it doesn't. It doesn't show that you don't value their life. If you could have saved their life, you definitely would. But it's better to save one life than allow two to die. And many people in other societies, because life was so hard and difficult, were forced to make the same kinds of decisions. Think about, for instance, the Spartans and the horrible practices they had for raising the children. Here again, life for the Spartans was very, very difficult and very different from our life. And in ancient times, people were always fighting with other civilizations. There wasn't stability, there wasn't peace. And so the whole Spartan civilization depended and hinged on them having the greatest war machine in antiquity. And so they had to train their children to be the best possible warriors. Otherwise, their entire civilization would have collapsed. And so here again, it's not that they had necessarily a different set of moral values than we did. It's just that life forced them to be the way they were. And probably if our society had similar difficult decisions or similar difficulties and hardships for survival, we too might adopt a different set of moral values. Finally, and this is the fourth point that Rachel's makes, is that many things which appear to be moral disagreements really and truly aren't moral disagreements, but the disagreements that exist are the result of underlying factual disputes. So he uses an example that involves Hindus and their beliefs about the sacred nature of cows. I'm going to use a different example because I think it better illustrates the point. But consider a moral dispute, that between people who are pro-life and people who are pro-choice. This seems like a moral dispute if there ever was a moral dispute. People get really worked up and get very hostile and very sensitive about the topic of abortion. However, technically speaking, this is not a moral disagreement at all. Now that might seem surprising to you, but remember when I talked about morality, we said morality involves involves ought and ought not. It involves should and should not. It involves saying things like X is right or X is wrong or X is permissible. But notice here, this dispute between people who are pro-life and pro-choice, they actually agree on the relevant moral issues. Both sides of the aisle would agree that murder is wrong. What people who are pro-life and pro-choice disagree about is whether or not killing a fetus is murder. And the reason they disagree about this is because they disagree about whether or not the fetus is a person. Now notice this question here. Is the fetus a person? Is not a normative claim. It is a descriptive claim. Is the fetus a person? Yes or no? That's a descriptive claim. There's no should or should not. The fetus is a person. And making that statement, you're not saying should or should not. Now, granted, that claim, the fetus is a person or the fetus is not a person, has moral implications. But technically speaking, it's a factual dispute about how we should classify the fetus. And so here again, what we have is an instance of what appears to be a moral disagreement, but really and truly that moral dispute is being driven by an underlying factual dispute. And so even people who are, as hostile as pro-life and pro-choice are with one another, they agree on the relevant moral issue. They just disagree about the underlying factual issue. So we see here what James Rachel's criticisms of the cultural differences argument are. As I said, his first point he makes is that the argument is invalid. And again, I think he's actually right about that. Now, that's not to say we couldn't revise the argument and reconstruct it to make it into a valid form, but as it stands, it needs some work. And secondly, he argues that premise 1 exaggerates the extent of cultural disagreements, and that at the end of the day, there are many, many more agreements than there may first appear, and there's certainly more than what the cultural relativist leads us to believe. Now, there is another argument that we looked at in this class. And the second argument we looked at is the education argument. Now, this isn't one that James Rachels addresses directly. It's one, as I said, that I've heard and I've seen people say, and it's up in the air, and you don't really see it in print that often. But we can make a similar criticism against the education argument to what James Rachels made against the cultural differences argument. And with the education argument, I actually have two criticisms of my own. And the very first criticism I have against the education argument is that just like with the cultural differences argument, this argument is also invalid. Why do I say that? Well, again, because the way this argument is constructed, it draws a conclusion about what is true based on what you do or would believe. It's basically just saying that had you been taught a different set of values, you would embrace those, and then it goes on to conclude that there are no objective moral truths. But just as we saw with the cultural differences argument, you cannot draw an inference based on what people believe to a conclusion about what is true. To give some parallel for this argument also, consider the following. Suppose you've been brought up to think the earth is flat. You might very well believe that. Does it follow that the earth has there's no objective truth about the earth's shape? Certainly that doesn't follow at all. Just because you may have grown up believing the earth was flat, it doesn't make it so. And the same thing can be said here. Just because you may have believed something else, it doesn't follow logically that there's no truth of the matter. So that's one point I want to make about this argument, is that it seems invalid because it's drawing a conclusion about what is true based on premises about what people believe. But there's a second point too I want to raise against this argument, which is just that it seems to rest on a false premise. And that premise is this right here, that people only have the moral values that they do because they were brought up to accept those. And that seems to me false. It seems to me to cut against what we experience. People change their values as they grow older. Looking back at my own life, I know that certain values I was taught when I was a kid, I have come to realize as I grew older, those things were wrong. You see people in our own society in the last handful of years, people have changed their views about gay marriage. If we go back even to the early 2000s, the overwhelming percentage of the country was against gay marriage. Now the majority of people support it. If we go back in time even further, people overwhelmingly in this country didn't value civil rights for minorities and women, and now they do. And so what this demonstrates is that people do change their values. And I think that we see this, and we've probably experienced it in our own lives. And we're able to do this, I believe, because we have this ability to view the things that we find valuable and understand the ways that we want to be treated, and then to recognize and put ourselves in another person's point of view. For instance, I can look at my own self and I can say, wow, I don't like being treated this way. I recognize that this other person is fundamentally no different from me. They probably wouldn't like to be treated this way either. Therefore, I shouldn't do that to them. And so even if we've been taught certain values growing up, we can reject those values and we can come to understand and have a better appreciation about how we should treat other people. And so this is all to say that the education argument fails for reasons that are very similar to why the cultural differences argument fails. This argument, just like the cultural differences argument, it's invalid because it draws a conclusion about what is true based on what people believe. Also, it rests on a false premise. People's values are not simply a function of what they were taught growing up. People can reason and engage rationally and investigate their own values and modify them and change those based on what seems reasonable and plausible to them as they grow older.